We continue from page 4 where we left off yesterday. It's another quote that Pattberg discussed on another book from Wittgenstein. He quotes, "Limits of my knowledge are the limits of my world." So what does that mean when we have defined ways through language? One argument from Lacan is that there is always a beyond of language. Yet we still require language to situate ourselves and to communicate and to interact, but that always means a limit. But what happens when there are other cultures, other ideas that are not part of our language? How do we relate to that? How do we relate to the other? This is important because then it brings in the question of what is racism? Is racism not then a question of how we relate to the other, or rather our inability to understand the other because we lack a framework of understanding from their perspective? So, as we continue on page 4, Pattberg further discusses the comparison between a philosopher and a sage. And let's also look at, from the other side, the Chinese word of philosophy. The Chinese word for philosophy is 哲学. What is interesting about this word is if we look at it, if we deconstruct the word, the second word is 学, which just means the study of 哲. And what is 哲? 哲 is divided by two main parts. The top part actually has the same pronunciation, but it means to fold. And the bottom part is a symbol of the mouth. Interestingly, this concept, this word 哲学, the Chinese word for philosophy, did not exist prior to the 19th century. Does that mean that 哲学 in philosophy as a concept, or the idea that the love of wisdom, did not exist prior to the 19th century in China? Rather, this concept was imported as a process of Western imperialism through Japan. In Japan, they were going through the modernization in the Meiji era, which is from 1868 until 1912. This is also a process of imperialism from the United States. And such concepts as 哲学 was introduced through Japan and brought into China. So, what happened before the 19th century? How did the Chinese understand or conceptualize the idea of wisdom? Because, as we can see, there is a civilization that goes on for more than 3,000 years. So in the book, I quote from American scholar Robert C. Neville, "Sages understand memories and expectations, guilt and frustrations, joys and sorrow, suffering, pain, triumph, ecstasy, nobility, depravity, honor, degradation, sincerity, mendacity, stress, and release. They understand the combinations and ambiguities of these in the lives of persons and in the affairs of all people. And their understanding allowed them so to follow the trail of what is important through the underbrush of triviality, that they cleave to what is essential. Sages are those who understand people. What people? Sages must live from long experience, not from intuitive encounters." End quote. So Dr. Pattberg offers another quick comparison that a philosopher is a wise man distinguished for wisdom and sound judgment, whereas a sage is a wise man distinguished for wisdom and from experience. According to this definition, philosophers and sages both are wise men. Being wise, wisdom in itself is a very broad term, And we shall see later that the sage's wisdom leans more towards sagacity, while the philosopher's wisdom leans more towards knowledge. But what is meant by sound judgment here? Sound means logical and coherent, the drawing of right conclusions from the given premises. Judgment, according to Immanuel Kant, the father of German rationality, is subjective universality. It means being indifferent to the existence of the object. As a result of that indifference, the philosopher's judgment will be ideally, quote, free from interest and inclinations, end quote. We could say also here, a philosopher does not need to connect to anything or anyone, nor does he have to be a good person, that's for the saints, or prove himself to be a worthy member of his community as sages do. Not the philosopher's person or moral character is idolized. His success will be judged solely against the novelty and provocation of the sound argument he presented. I feel like here it really strikes home a startling difference. I'm sure we all know the philosopher department trope, the philosophy students that are endlessly debating and advocating and fighting for a certain school of argumentation, yet there's always something missing. There seems to be a separation of oneself from the society, that the idea in itself seems to be above everybody else. And so, is it not any wonder that there seems to be all these tropes, like, especially for the West, of into the wild? You can see, as much so in the intellectuals and the bourgeoisie, that it doesn't seem to be the interest of the group, and that the more a person acquires in intellectualism or material success, that the end goal seems to be to get that nice house in Portugal or a place in the countryside. And so as a contrast for the sage, or even more so for the Shengren, that it is a person held together with a society. These days we see a lot of these capitalistic needs of community. But the irony is that one must continuously pay into a system of monthly subscriptions. Otherwise, one is no longer allowed to be in community. He continues, the ancient Greeks thought of a philosopher as an eternal seeker of wisdom, someone who always searches the truth, comes close to it, but ultimately cannot attain perfect wisdom ever. Perfection was reserved for the gods, if that. As opposed to a philosopher, the sage or sophos in ancient Greece was considered the bearer of wisdom. Someone who also already possessed wisdom and only needed to self-actualize himself. He was, for the lack of better words, a demigod. Plato was proud to be a philosopher. He argued that a sage or sophos, by definition, was impartial to the joys of truth-seeking. Because the sophos claimed he already possessed that wisdom. In Plato's understanding, only a philosophos, a lover of wisdom, fully realizes that A, a perfect wisdom was unattainable, and B, that one nevertheless must seek new knowledge, knowledge that would ever lead closer to the light. Sages were already light, and Plato could not take light. He preferred law. Only the eternal condemnation, one's calling towards searching the truth, was true love. Consequently, Greek philosophers developed an aversion to sages and their perceived arrogance and hypocrisies, their acted sagacity. Neville gives the following definitions of sagacity. Sagacity first requires that one understands people. At the heart of this is the understanding of how people perceive, think, and act. Most people are aware of what they perceive, think, and do, but usually not the texture of their perceiving, thinking, and acting as such. These three activities constitute a person's most basic orientation towards the world. Plato and his disciples condemned the sage's character and called into doubt his sagely motivations. In the Sophist, and the Republic, he described the Sophos as having a false sense of divine inspiration and suffering from a delusion about their own mythical status. Plato further ascribed to the sage a highly manipulative character and an erroneous belief in human supernatural and esoteric powers. From the philosopher's point of view, the sages did not seek, nor did they really care much about the truth. All the sages thought and cared about was allegedly their status, power, and influence. Like a false prophet who seeks an elevated place from where he could air his wrong beliefs and propagate his erroneous teachings. Unsurprisingly, Plato's criticism of the sages was an attack on Athenian politicians, as well as quack doctors, charlatans, and the competitors to his academy, named patron of today's academics and academia. So here he's building this observation which, from the Western contemporary understanding, we really have this distrust, and rightly so a lot of times, of, let's say, snake oil salesmen. But can we also not see this ever truth-seeking addiction similar to Lacan's conceptuation of objet petit a, this never fulfillable desire, that it is always a bit further ahead. But how can that be used in terms of population control? To forbid anybody to ever reach the sanctity of wisdom, of understanding. We must therefore always rely on a larger authority that is beyond us. And here we can see the connection of the church and the way that we think. And so this question of translation, it's important to understand what comes as baggage to any word. And when we translate and we take another language, what are some of our projections and baggages that we bring about and we force onto another culture's conceptuation? So as we continue with this book, we are trained to start thinking on a term beyond its given definitions or problematic translations, limited translations. But we begin to think comparatively from a different angle and to extend that examination. One thing that came to mind was that when I was a kid, my mother taught me how to play the game Go. It's a Chinese chess, Weiqi. And this game is a very important game that all scholars are expected to learn because it teaches one about strategy. But furthermore, it's a game that teaches, believe it or not, self-cultivation. So before I actually learn any of the strategies and ways to compete, and in the West we might think of ways to dominate the opponent, my mother implored the concept of Junzi to me. And Junzi is another term that I think is important to examine next to Shengren. A Junzi, if we break it down, again, limited by problematic translations, we start from the second word zi, which means usually a son or a child, but in this case is also understood as a master or scholar. And Jin, it means a sovereign or lord or ruler, but that's the English translation. A Junzi is somebody, when I first understood it and was taught, was somebody that not only understands the art side of the martial art, but also the physicality. It embodies a large range of personhood. Let's look at them. First, we have the idea of ren, which means benevolence. Yi, righteousness. Li, ritual. Zi, wisdom. Xin, trustworthiness. Xiao, filial piety. Self-cultivation, humility, and modesty. And what does this contrast with? When I think of the Christian values. A lot of times I think of this 10 Commandments. But what are the 10 Commandments? It is a series of thou shalt not. And the thou shalt not is very interesting when we think of how desire is constructed. This idea that precisely because one is told not to do something, that one is even tempted to do precisely the opposite. And is it any wonder that today we are also proliferated by problems of narcissism, competitiveness? We are not cultivating some of these first principle engagements of what it means to be a Junzi. Further on to page 15, Dr. Pattberg also discusses the German translation, one other possibility, der Weise, which is not a complete taboo like der Führer. And there are no semantic connection between those words, nevertheless the idea of pejorative arises. Der Weise, the sage, has lost much of its goodwill, if the sophist ever deserved any, in terms of integrity and reality of the person describes. It could actually harm a philosopher's reputation to be labeled as Weise. The following is a list of Weise terms used in German traditions. All of these terms are either pejorative in nature or archaic and reserved for mythology, legend, and fantastic literature. Let's look at them. 1. Sophos, the wise man, Socrates, which is archaic. 2. The Stoic sage, the sophist of Greek antiquity, archaic and pejorative. 3. The three wise men, the Oriental sage, which is un-European. 4. Nathan the Wise, Lessing, which is un-European. Die weise alte Frau, der weise alte Mann, fairy tales, folkloric. 6. Refer to a melody. Weise meant elevated, archaic, outdated. 7. The wise man as archetype, Grimm, Jung, mythic, folkloric. And 8. Wise men in fiction, fantasy, literature, fantastic. And perhaps just as Friedrich Nietzsche has observed that the Christian Western tradition has been tormented by the conceptuation of the slave morality, that one should not dare to think above and beyond, that one should always give way to the past or to the system, the state. We are terrified to take a step to become the Übermensch, the Superman. However, the concept of Junzi or the Shengren is not promoting the idea that one should be superior above others, to dominate one another, or to become a lord and ruler of another, but rather it is important to bring in the understanding of responsibility, of filial piety. It is important for one to cultivate oneself to become a Junzi or a Shengren, that one takes responsibility and give back to the community. That is, in a community that is not intrinsically linked to a consumeristic, capitalistic model. And as we continue to work on through this book, I'd like to continuously bring us back to the question of what is at stake. This is hopefully not just an indoctrination of promotion of one culture over another. And why focus on the translation and even on this just one word? Here it's not a question of the importance of the Chinese language or the Chinese culture, and what does that even mean today? Is China today currently engaging in the cultivation of Shengren? That's something that we can all try to ask for ourselves, and history will tell. But rather, it is constantly the question of what are the effects of white supremacy, of Western imperialism, and to give light to this constant invisibilizing project of settler colonialism. And today, being October 8th, marks an entire year of this ongoing genocide, which is again not just starting from last year, but has been 75 years prior. And if we really zoom out, it is an ongoing linguistic project. It requires a linguistic imperialism which informs our thinking and our judgment. It informs what we prioritize and who do we diminish. Bringing back to Edward Said's project of Orientalism and what it exposed there is the way in which linguistic imperialism allows the white supremacists to borrow, to steal, to flatten, which eventually leads to the dehumanization of everybody and everything that is beyond our knowledge.